Translating cultures is one of 4 research themes for the AHRC, alongside science and culture, care for the future and digital transformations. And each theme seeks to create a space for new innovative thinking and new research to take place by identifying a set of issues which can really benefit from being approached from a range of different disciplinary perspectives.
The emphasis is on translation, but also on interpreting, on multilingualism, on a whole series of processes whereby languages come into contact and intermingle and interact. But I think what's important is to remember we're looking at translating together with the idea of cultures. Through friction, conflict, contact, various forms of collaboration.
We have, for example, perspectives from history, from the performance arts, from philosophy, but very naturally also from modern language studies.
So the 3 large grants are on transnationalising modern languages, looking at, this was specifically at Italian culture in various diasporic contexts, on translation and translanguaging, which is looking at super diverse wards in British cities, and also on translation issues in situations where individuals are under extreme pressure.
Our project is called Researching Multilingually at the Borders of the Body, Language, Law and the State. And we've got 2 aims. The first one is to look at what happens to languages when they're under pain or pressure in very challenging contexts. And one thing we know from research so far is that language behaves differently in different contexts, and people use their languages differently, particularly when they're under pain or pressure, when they've suffered trauma. And then to look at how it is we research using languages in contexts where languages are under pain and pressure. Conflict is at the heart of our everyday life, and people experience that conflict and are afraid of that conflict in many different ways. The final case study is looking at how we research the use of languages in the legal process, particularly in determining asylum claims. We know that often people will tell their story and it will be translated by people who the person telling their story to has never met before. We know that some of the things translators have to translate in those narratives are highly traumatizing, and that translators themselves can often experience secondary trauma. We know that translating in a courtroom setting or in a very formal office is a strange, rather dehumanizing experience, and we're wanting to compare how different jurisdictions do that within the United Kingdom, but also in the Netherlands.
Our project is looking at 2 intertwined themes, let's say. On the one hand, we are reclaiming translation, cultural translation from a modern languages perspective, and thinking about how modern languages can be rethought from a transnational perspective, not just anchored to one nation at a time. And on the other, we're using it as our case study, 150 years of Italian mobility scattered across the world. And we're working with partners across the entire world, from Australia to South America to the UK. Because the Italian case study, as we call it, is an excellent example of how translation is already built into a culture. It's always already there, and you can't really think about the history of Italian culture without thinking about mobility, about how people have moved in and out of the nation, and how the language has spread, but also new languages have brought new things to the nation. And then that kind of model and that kind of case study can be extended to other languages and other cases.
The name of our project is Translation and Translanguaging, and we're interested in what we're calling super diverse cities. Our urban landscapes are changing. There's increased mobility through globalization. And because of that, there's lots of languages in play in our cities. And it's that aspect of communication across different institutions in our cities that we're interested in.
And we're looking at 4 different cities around the UK, and the way that in those cities people use all sorts of different languages in their daily interactions. We're going into particular sites within each of the 4 cities. So we're going to go to a business site, a sports site, a legal advice site, and the last one is a business site, not in that order. And we're going to, within each of those sites, look at how people are using languages and how people are operating really in a multilingual environment.
As we work with institutions, we expect to be able to contribute to discussions about institutional policies on multilingualism, understand better the role of multilingualism in improving access to sports and well-being, to business, startups and facilities. So there's a whole community that we hope to have an impact in.
One of the things I was saying in my lecture this morning is that, as Octavio Paz, the great Mexican writer, points out, translation shows us that our neighbours do not think and speak as we do. And it's trying to get past, trying to negotiate that, what is effectively cultural difference, that makes translation so fascinating and so complex and so also potentially dangerous. Because if you get it wrong, there can be all kinds of difficulties that emerge.
What I'm doing is writing a counter-history of British foreign policy, which, instead of starting with what British foreign policy makers are doing, starts with the connections that already exist between British foreign policy institutions and similar institutions around the world. And so that brings translation right into the middle of everything, rather than leaving it at the margins. Instead of translation being what gets done to a document, rather translation is what sort of constitutes international relations. And what I hope to achieve is to have policymakers think a bit more about the context in which they're making decisions and how the outside is always already inside.
Our researchers are contributing to debates and policy in areas as diverse as diplomacy, overseas aid, museum policy, and in areas such as education, bilingual education, multilingual education. Academically, I hope the theme is going to allow researchers from across the arts and humanities always to factor in questions of translation and language to their research projects, and to ask themselves, if I'm not considering translation and language, what am I possibly missing out in my research?
They're questions of ethics, they're questions about politics, they're questions about how we learn to live together so that we might flourish for one another.